He stood on the precipice of forever, the world reduced to a splintered beam and a fraying rope, ready to end it all, until 5 small voices, like the rustling of autumn leaves, whispered from the shadows of the hayloft, "Sir, please don't." Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The air in the barn was thick with the ghosts of better years. It smelled of dry rot and dead memories, a scent Elias had come to know as the perfume of failure. Each mote of dust that danced in the slivers of afternoon light seemed to be a tiny particle of his grandfather's hopes, now just settling on the floor like everything else. The barn was a cathedral of his ruin, the great vaulted ceiling a testament to a legacy he had successfully driven into the ground. He ran a calloused thumb over the rough, fibrous surface of the rope. It felt honest. It didn't make promises it couldn't keep. It didn't speak of crop prices or rainfall or the hollow words of bankers in stiff collars. It offered only a simple, quiet transaction, an end to the noise. The noise had been the worst part, not the shouting of the auctioneer, his voice a hammer cracking the foundation of their family name, nor the sympathetic, useless whispers of neighbors. It was the silence that screamed the loudest. The silence of the farmhouse that evening, stripped of his wife's tired sighs and the scent of her baking. The silence of the fields, no longer his to plow. The silence of his own heart, which he was sure had stopped beating weeks ago and was now just a dead weight in his chest. He kicked an old milk crate into position beneath the central beam, the sound echoing in the vast emptiness. It was a sturdy beam, made of old-growth oak, felled by his great-grandfather a century ago. It had held up the roof through blizzards and droughts, a silent witness to births and deaths, to prosperity, and now, to this. There was a grim poetry in that, he thought, to have the last of his line swing from the very thing that was meant to provide shelter. He fashioned the loop with a practiced mechanical calm he hadn't felt in months. The knot was a farmer's knot, strong and reliable. He'd used it 1,000 times to secure livestock, to hoist engines, to bind the harvests that were now someone else's property. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He threw the other end over the beam. It landed with a soft thud, sending up a little puff of dust. He looked at it hanging there, a patient, swaying question mark against the dying light. This was it. The final calculation. The last debt to be paid. He stepped onto the crate, his worn boots unsteady for a moment. He reached up, his hand closing around the coarse braid. It was time to silence the noise for good. And then he heard it. A sound so small it was almost consumed by the creaking of the old wood. A rustle, a shuffle from the deep shadows of the hayloft above him. He froze, his hand still on the rope. It was probably just a rat, a fat barn rat, grown bold in the quiet of the abandoned space. But then the whisper came, tumbling down from the darkness like a single delicate seed. It was a child's voice, fragile and trembling, and it was followed by another and another, a chorus of hushed desperation. "Sir, please don't." Elias's first reaction was not compassion, but a surge of pure, undiluted rage. It was a violation. This place, this moment was his. It was the one private, sacred right he had left, and it had been trespassed upon. His failure was meant to be a solitary performance. "Get out," he snarled, his voice a ragged tear in the silence. He didn't look up. He couldn't. His gaze was fixed on the rope, on the escape it represented, and the thought of facing an audience now was unbearable. He felt their presence like a physical weight, a collection of eyes in the darkness, pinning him to his wretched stage. The silence that answered his command was more profound than before. It was a fearful silence, a held breath. He could feel it, the frantic, terrified stillness of cornered animals. He finally forced his head up, squinting into the gloom of the loft. At first, he saw nothing but stacks of old, rotting hay. Then a shape moved. A small face, smudged with dirt, peered over the edge. Then another, and another. 5 of them. 5 small, dark-eyed children, their faces pale with fear in the fading light. They were Indigenous children. He could see that much. Their clothes were worn, their hair unkempt. They looked like little ghosts, apparitions conjured from the dust and regret that filled the barn. "I said get out," he repeated, his voice shaking now, not with rage, but with a confusing, volatile mix of anger and shock. "This is private property, my property. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. It hadn't been his property for 2 weeks. The oldest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 10, pushed herself slightly forward. Her expression wasn't just fearful, it was fiercely protective. Her arms were spread slightly, as if to shield the smaller children behind her. "We're sorry, sir," she said, her voice barely audible but clear. "We didn't mean no trouble. We'll be quiet." Her words did nothing to soothe him. They only amplified the intrusion. Quiet? They had shattered the most profound quiet he was ever going to know. He felt a wild, desperate urge to scream at them, to scare them away, to reclaim his despair. But the sight of them huddled together, so small and so terrified, held him in place. One of the youngest, a little boy with a hacking cough, let out a whimper. The girl immediately put a hand on his shoulder, murmuring something to him in a language Elias didn't understand. The sound was soft, melodic, and utterly alien in the heart of his misery. It was the sound of life, of care, of a world that existed beyond his own suffocating pain. He slowly, deliberately took his hand off the rope. The gesture felt monumental, as if he were letting go of an anchor in a storm. He stepped down from the milk crate, his knees weak. He was no longer a man seeking an end. He was a man with a problem of 5 small, shivering, and unwelcome witnesses. The knot in the rope was a mirror to the knot in his stomach. Each had been tied with a purpose that now felt distant, almost foreign. He stared at the beam, then at the loft, then back at the rope. Just an hour ago, this barn had been a tomb of his own design, a final resting place for a name and a bloodline. Now it was just a barn again, filled with the inconvenient pulse of other people's lives. The memory of the auctioneer's voice returned, unbidden. It wasn't a shout, but a steady rhythmic drone, the sound of a machine dismantling his world piece by piece. "Lot 1, the farmhouse and 160 acres. A legacy property, gentlemen. Who'll start the bidding for this piece of history?" He remembered standing at the back of the crowd, hidden by the shade of a maple his father had planted. He had watched men he'd known his whole life, men who had shared his table and drank his liquor, raise their hands. They weren't cruel, they were practical. Land was land. A man's failure was another man's opportunity. He didn't blame them. He blamed the rain that didn't fall, the blight that did, and the cold, unfeeling arithmetic of the bank loan that had become a noose long before he'd picked up this rope. He saw his wife, Sarah, in his mind's eye, not as she was in the end, thin, worn, her eyes perpetually fixed on the horizon as if looking for an escape, but as she had been when they were young, her laughter echoing in the kitchen, her hands covered in flour. She had fought for the farm, for him, until there was no fight left in her. The day she'd packed her single suitcase, she hadn't cried. That was the worst part. Her face was a mask of exhausted resignation. "I can't watch you do this to yourself anymore, Elias," she had said, her voice flat. "There's nothing left here, nothing but ghosts." She was right. After she left, the ghosts had moved in, the ghost of his father, whose disappointed gaze he felt in every corner of the house, the ghost of his grandfather, whose hands had cleared this land and whose strength felt like a constant silent rebuke of his own weakness, and the most terrible ghost of all, the future he was supposed to build, a shimmering, beautiful thing that had dissolved into smoke. He had walked through the empty farmhouse one last time, his footsteps echoing on the bare wood floors. The ghosts were quiet then, as if they too were packing their bags. The silence was absolute. He had closed the door, not locking it, and walked to the barn. The barn was the heart of it all. It was where he'd been born, in a sense, where he'd learned to work, to be a man. It felt right that it should be where he ended. This carefully constructed narrative of his end, this final dramatic act of a failed man, was all he had left. It was his story to write. And now, 5 pairs of eyes in a hayloft had stolen his pen. He didn't speak to them again for a long time. He simply stood there, in the middle of the floor, a man unplugged from his own purpose. The sun sank lower and the slivers of light crawling across the floorboards turned from gold to a deep, bruised orange. The barn grew colder. The cough from the loft returned, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to scrape at the inside of the boy's small chest. Each time it was followed by the girl's soft murmuring. Elias found himself listening to the rhythm of it, the harsh cough, the gentle shushing. It was a miserable symphony, but it was a sound that had nothing to do with his own self-pity. He walked over to the old water pump in the corner, its iron handle rusted stiff. It hadn't been used in years. He put his weight on it, grunting with the effort. A groan of metal on metal, then a sucking sound, and finally a gush of coppery, stale water into the dusty basin. He cupped his hands and drank, the cold shocking his system. He splashed the water on his face, trying to wash away the last hour, the last year. It didn't work. When he looked up again, the oldest girl was watching him, her dark eyes wide and unblinking. She was the leader. It was plain to see. The others were her flock, and she was the wary, defiant shepherdess. She was small for her age, wiry and tough, with a smudge of dirt on her high cheekbone that looked like a warrior's mark. He saw a flicker of himself in her. Not the broken man he was now, but the boy he used to be. The boy who believed he could hold the world in his hands and protect it from harm. The thought was unwelcome, a sliver of glass under the skin. "You kids hungry?" The words came out before he'd consciously formed them. They sounded foreign in his own mouth, gruff and clumsy. For a moment there was no response. The girl's eyes narrowed slightly, a look of deep suspicion crossing her face. She was deciding if he was a threat, if this was a trick. In her world, he realized, kindness from a man like him was probably a weapon in disguise. Then, one of the smaller children, a girl with 2 long braids, nodded her head, a quick, jerky motion she immediately tried to hide. It was enough. The girl's stony facade cracked for just a second. She gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He turned without another word and walked out of the barn, leaving the rope hanging from the beam like a forgotten thought. He walked toward the farmhouse, its windows dark and vacant. He wasn't sure what he was doing. He was just moving, putting one foot in front of the other, propelled by a question he hadn't asked and an answer he didn't have. For the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about the end. He was thinking about a piece of bread. The farmhouse kitchen was a cold, hollow space. It smelled of dust and disuse. He found a half-eaten loaf of bread on the counter, stale but not yet moldy. There was a small wedge of hard cheese in the cooler and a few wrinkled apples in a bowl. It was a pauper's feast. He wrapped it all in a dish rag and took the last of the clean water from the pail. As he walked back towards the barn, he saw the headlights. They cut through the twilight, sweeping across the fallow fields before turning up his long, unkempt driveway. It was Sheriff Brody's truck. Elias's heart seized, a cold fist of panic clenching in his chest. Brody was a man who operated on suspicion and gossip, a man who saw the world in black and white, law and disorder. And to a man like Brody, 5 native children in a white man's barn would only mean one thing: trouble. He quickened his pace, his mind racing. He reached the great barn doors just as the truck crunched to a halt behind him, bathing him in the sterile glare of its headlights. "Elias." Brody's voice was gravelly, accustomed to command. He got out of the truck, leaving the engine running. He was a big man. His uniform stretched tight over a swelling belly. He hitched his belt, a familiar gesture of casual authority. "Evening, Brody," Elias said, his own voice tight. He consciously kept his body positioned in front of the barn door, a flimsy human shield. "Everything all right out here?" Heard the bank finally took the place. Brody's attempt at sympathy was as thin as old paint. His eyes weren't looking at Elias. They were scanning the property, taking in the overgrown weeds, the peeling paint on the house, the general air of decay. His gaze lingered on the barn. "Just tying up loose ends," Elias said, the lie coming more easily this time. He held up the rag-wrapped food. "Grabbing a few things I left behind," Brody grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Funny, Mrs. Gable called me an hour ago. Swore she saw some vagrants sneaking onto your property. Kids," she said. "The dirty kind." The phrase hung in the air between them, thick and ugly. The dirty kind. It was the casual cruelty of it that struck Elias, the way Brody said it as if he were describing vermin. In that moment, the children in the loft ceased to be an intrusion. They were just children, and he, for reasons he could not articulate, was the only thing standing between them and a man like Brody. "Mrs. Gable sees things," Elias said, forcing a weary, dismissive tone. "Her eyes are as old as her rumors. It was just me, Brody, poking around my own ghosts. You know how it is." He tried to make it sound like the pathetic rambling of a broken man, a performance he knew all too well. Brody seemed to consider this, his gaze still fixed on the barn. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the idling of the truck's engine. Elias could feel the children's fear radiating through the wood of the barn door. "Please stay quiet," he begged them silently. "Please." Finally, Brody shrugged. "All right, Elias, but you keep an eye out. Don't need any trouble out this way." He got back in his truck, the springs groaning in protest. He backed up, turned around and drove away, his taillights shrinking into red pinpricks in the gathering dark. Elias stood there until the sound of the engine was completely gone, his body trembling with an adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. He had lied. He had stood his ground. He had protected them. He turned and looked at the barn, no longer a tomb, but now, impossibly, a sanctuary. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped back into the gloom. The air was still and charged. He could feel their eyes on him, questioning. He walked to the base of the ladder and set the bundle of food down. He didn't say anything. He just looked up into the darkness of the loft. After a moment, a small rope ladder, one he hadn't noticed before, snaked down from above. The oldest girl descended first, her movements nimble and quiet as a cat. She stepped onto the barn floor and stared at him, her face a mask of cautious curiosity. The other four followed one by one, emerging from the shadows like hesitant spirits. They were even smaller up close, their faces smudged and their bodies thin beneath their worn clothes. The little boy was still coughing, a deep, persistent bark that shook his tiny frame. They huddled behind the girl, using her as their shield. She looked at the food on the floor, then back at him. It was a standoff, a silent negotiation of trust. Elias gestured toward the bundle with his chin. "It's not much," he said, "but it's what I've got." The girl didn't move. She was studying his face, searching for the trick, the angle. He understood. In their world, nothing was free. Everything had a price, usually one paid in dignity or freedom. He sighed and sat down on an overturned bucket, turning his body slightly away from them to seem less threatening. He picked up a splinter of wood from the floor and began to whittle at it with his thumbnail, not looking at them. He was giving them space, a small island of autonomy in his world. He wanted them to make the choice. Minutes passed. The only sounds were the boys' muffled coughs and the whisper of Elias's nail against the wood. Finally, he heard a soft shuffle. He risked a glance from the corner of his eye. The girl had crept forward. She knelt and cautiously unwrapped the dish rag. She broke the stale bread into 5 small pieces, giving the largest to the sick boy. She did the same with the cheese and the apples. She took the smallest piece for herself, only after the others had begun to eat. They ate with a desperate, silent ferocity that spoke of days of hunger. It was a painful thing to watch. He had pitied himself for his lost legacy, for his empty house. These children were fighting for their next breath. His own problems suddenly felt indulgent, the concerns of a man who had possessed enough to lose it. When they were finished, the girl carefully gathered the crumbs into the rag and folded it. She looked at him, a flicker of something other than fear in her eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or maybe just a simple acknowledgement of a transaction completed. "Thank you," she whispered. "My name is Elias," he said, the first time he'd offered it to anyone in weeks. She hesitated for a second, as if weighing the value of the information she was about to give. "I am Chayton," she said. The name meant falcon. It suited her. He nodded, and a fragile, unspoken truce settled between them in the dusty, quiet air of the barn. The barn had its own memories, its own ghosts, but now they were being crowded out by new ones. The ghost of a feast, the ghost of a shared silence. As night fell completely, the world outside the barn doors shrank to nothing. Inside, under the watch of the hanging rope, a strange, temporary family had formed. The children huddled together for warmth in a pile of old hay, their breathing slow and rhythmic in sleep. All except Chayton. She sat awake, a small, silent sentinel, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the barn. Elias watched her, seeing a strength that shamed him. He had been ready to surrender, to let the darkness take him. This child, with nothing but 4 younger souls to care for, refused to even blink. He found himself thinking of his own son, Thomas. The memory was a locked room in his heart, a place he never visited. Thomas had been small, like the coughing boy. He'd had the same dark hair, the same fragile bird-like bones. He'd been taken by a fever when he was 6, a sudden, merciless illness that had swept through the county one winter. It had been the first crack in the foundation of his world. Sarah had cried for months. Elias had not. He had worked. He had thrown himself into the farm, into the mindless, punishing labor, trying to build a wall of exhaustion around his grief. But the grief was patient. It had seeped through the cracks, poisoning the soil of their marriage, withering his own soul from the inside out. He had blamed himself. He hadn't been there when the fever broke. He had been in town, arguing with the man at the feed store over the price of grain, a meaningless, prideful dispute. By the time he returned, the doctor was leaving, his face grim. He never forgave himself for that, for choosing pride over presence. Looking at the small, sick boy shivering in the hay, the locked door in his heart creaked open. The old pain, sharp and undiluted, rushed in. It was an agony he thought he had buried forever. But this time it felt different. It wasn't just a self-destructive poison, it was a catalyst. The guilt he felt for Thomas, a guilt that had driven him towards the rope, was now transmuting into a fierce, protective urge for this other boy, this stranger. He walked over to the huddle of sleeping children. The boy was muttering in his sleep, his forehead slick with sweat. He was burning up. Elias gently placed the back of his hand on the boy's brow. The heat was alarming. This wasn't just a cold, it was something more serious. Chayton watched his every move, her body tensed, ready to spring. "He's sick," Elias said, his voice low. "He needs medicine." Chayton's face, already so serious, hardened further. "We cannot go to a doctor. They will take us. They will send us back." Her voice was laced with a terror so profound it made Elias's own despair feel shallow. Send them back where? What place could be so terrible that a fever in a dusty barn was the better option? He didn't ask. The fear in her eyes was answer enough. He was no longer just a man hiding children. He was a man hiding them from something he couldn't yet name, but which he was beginning to understand was far more dangerous than Sheriff Brody. The next morning, the air was sharp with the coming of a true, hard autumn. The boy's fever had not broken. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by weak, rattling coughs that seemed to steal the very air from the barn. Elias knew that kind of fever. He had seen it in livestock, and he had seen it once before in a small boy with dark hair. He had to do something. Leaving Chayton on guard, a miniature general commanding her tiny, frightened army, he slipped out of the barn at first light. He didn't go towards the town. He went towards the woods, towards the old knowledge his grandfather had taught him, the things that predated doctors and drugstores. He gathered willow bark for the fever and mullein for the lungs. He felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known since he'd last walked these woods with his father. He was a farmer again, not of crops, but of remedies, a healer. He returned to find the barn in a state of tense silence. He boiled the bark and leaves in an old tin can over a small, carefully concealed fire. He cooled the bitter tea and knelt by the sick boy. Chayton watched, her skepticism warring with her desperation. "Let me," she said, taking the tin cup from his hands. She lifted the boy's head and coaxed the medicine into him, a spoonful at a time. It was an act of trust, a concession. She was letting him in, just a little. Later that afternoon, as the boy slept a more peaceful sleep, the fever having receded slightly, the sound of an engine returned. It was Brody's truck again, and this time it wasn't alone. A second car, a dusty sedan, pulled in behind it. A woman got out. Mrs. Gable. She was a bird-like woman with a sharp nose and sharper eyes, the kind of person who curated the town's ledger of sins and secrets. Brody approached the barn, his face set like stone. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Elias," he boomed. "Mrs. Gable here says she saw smoke coming from your barn this morning. Says she heard noises last night too. Crying like." Mrs. Gable nodded vigorously, her eyes darting around, hungry for confirmation of her suspicions. "It's vagrants, Sheriff." "I know it is. Probably those natives from the reservation. Always causing trouble." Elias's blood ran cold. He stepped in front of the door, his body a barricade once more. "I was burning some old papers, Brody, and the only crying you heard was me, crying over this damned place." He let his voice crack, injecting it with the authentic misery he knew so well. "A man's allowed to grieve, isn't he?" Brody's expression was unreadable. but Mrs. Gable was not convinced. "There are children in there," she hissed, pointing a bony finger at the barn. "I heard them." The accusation hung in the air, a declaration of war. Brody looked from her to Elias, then to the imposing silent barn. He put his hand on his holster. It wasn't an overt threat, just a reminder of where the power lay. "I'm losing my patience, Elias. You know we've had reports of runaways from the school up north. It's my duty to check." The school. The word landed like a stone in Elias's gut. He knew of the place, a grim brick building where they sent Indigenous children to civilize them, to strip them of their language, their families, their names. The terror in Chayton's eyes finally had a name. "There's no one in there, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "But if you don't believe me, you're welcome to your duty." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "But you'll come back with a warrant, and you'll do it at dawn. Give a man the dignity of one last night in his own home." It was a bluff, a desperate gamble, but it was delivered with the conviction of a man who had nothing left to lose, which was almost true. Brody stared at him for a long, hard moment. He hated paperwork, he hated complications, and he saw a broken man who was more trouble than he was worth. "Dawn, Elias," he said, his voice cold. "Be ready." They left, leaving Elias alone with a death sentence. Not his own this time, but one for the 5 children huddled in the hay. Panic was a physical thing, a cold liquid flooding his veins. Dawn. He had until dawn. He stumbled back into the barn, the heavy door booming shut behind him, a sound of finality. Chayton was on her feet instantly, the other children scrambling behind her. They had heard. They knew. Her face was a mask of stoic terror. She didn't ask what they were going to do. Her expression made it clear she believed there was nothing they could do. They had been running their whole lives, and the running was finally over. But Elias was no longer the man who had stood on the milk crate. The part of him that sought surrender was dead. It had been replaced by something else, something forged in the last 24 hours. A stubborn, defiant will to protect. He looked around the barn, his barn, the place he knew better than his own skin. He had played in every corner as a boy, worked in every stall as a man. His mind raced, cataloging, searching. The hayloft was too obvious. The stalls were too open. He needed a place that didn't exist, a place forgotten. And then he remembered. The root cellar. It was a relic from his great-grandfather's time, before the farmhouse had a proper basement. A small stone-lined pit dug into the earth beneath the barn floor, hidden under a set of heavy, flush-mounted floorboards right below the main threshing area. They hadn't used it in 50 years. It was covered by dirt, hay, and the accumulated debris of decades. No one knew it was there. No one but him. "Come on," he said, his voice urgent. He grabbed an old shovel and started clearing the floor in the center of the barn. Chayton watched him, confused. Then a flicker of understanding, of hope ignited in her eyes. She grabbed a smaller spade and began to help, the other children following her lead, using their bare hands to scrape away the dirt and hay. They worked in a frantic, desperate silence. The floorboards were heavy, swollen with a century of damp. It took all of Elias's strength to pry the first one up, revealing a black, cavernous space that smelled of cold earth and trapped time. He lowered a lantern into the darkness. It was small, no bigger than a closet, but it was dry, and it was invisible. He helped them down, one by one. The sick boy, whose name he learned was Noden, was weak but breathing easier. Elias passed down the last of the water and a thick horse blanket. He looked at Chayton, her small face illuminated by the lantern light from below. She looked like a general in a bunker, preparing for a siege. "Don't make a sound," he whispered. "No matter what you hear. Don't make a sound until I come for you." She just nodded, her eyes conveying a trust that was both a gift and a terrible burden. He lowered the heavy floorboards back into place. He spent the next hour meticulously covering them, scattering hay and dirt, kicking dust over the seams until it looked as if it had been undisturbed for a lifetime. He worked until his hands were raw and his back screamed in protest. When he was done, the floor was just a floor again. The secret was buried. He climbed the ladder to the loft and retrieved the rope. He didn't take it down. He retied the noose, making it look convincing. Ready. Then he sat on the milk crate below it, a bottle of whiskey he'd found in the tack room in his hand, and waited for the dawn. The first light of dawn was gray and unforgiving, painting the world in shades of ash. It came with the sound of tires on gravel, Brody's truck, and another car filled with grim-faced men from town, their breath pluming in the cold air. They were a posse, hungry for righteousness. Elias didn't move from his crate. He took a long pull from the whiskey bottle as Brody and two other men pushed open the barn doors. The light flooded in, framing them in the entrance like dark angels of judgment. The rope swayed gently above his head. Brody stopped short, taking in the scene. The broken man, the bottle, the noose. It was a perfect portrait of despair, exactly as Elias had designed it. "Morning, Sheriff," Elias slurred, making his voice thick. "Come for the show?" Brody's face was a mixture of disgust and perhaps a sliver of pity. "Get up, Elias. We're searching the barn." Elias laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Be my guest. Tear it all down. What's one more thing taken from me?" He waved his hand magnanimously. "Search the stalls. Check the loft. You'll find rats and spiders and the ghost of my father, but you won't find any kids." He held the sheriff's gaze, his own eyes filled with a pain that was only partly an act. The men, now slightly less certain, began their search. They were clumsy, loud. They kicked over empty buckets, poked pitchforks into the hayloft, their voices echoing in the vast space. Elias watched them, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Every footstep on the floorboards above the cellar was a hammer blow to his nerves. He forced himself to stay still, to keep playing the part of the drunk on the edge of oblivion. He prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in years, praying for the silence of 5 small children. One of the men, a wiry farmer named Hank, stomped right over the hidden door. Elias's breath caught in his throat. Hank paused, looking down. "Floor's uneven here," he grunted, kicking at the spot. "Ground's probably settling," Brody said, his voice impatient. He was clearly growing tired of the charade. He wanted this to be over. He walked over to Elias and looked up at the rope. "You really planning on using that thing?" he asked, his voice softer now, the official hardness gone for a moment. Elias looked up at it too. It looked alien to him now, an artifact from a different life. "A man gets tired, Brody," he said, the words raw and real. "Just tired of it all." The search was fruitless. The men gathered at the door, grumbling, their righteous fire dampened. They had found nothing but the stench of failure and whiskey. "Satisfied?" Elias asked. Brody gave him one last, long look. He saw a man at the absolute end of his rope, literally and figuratively. He saw nothing else. He couldn't see the fierce, protective core that had grown in the center of the ruin. "Yeah," Brody said, turning away. "We're satisfied. Get some help, Elias." They left. The sound of their engines faded, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence. Elias waited, not moving until the sun was fully risen, a brilliant, hopeful gold. He stood up, steady on his feet, and put the whiskey bottle down. He walked to the center of the barn, knelt, and began to uncover the door to the world he had saved.